Thank you very much.
Let's talk about your impressions. Now that basically the trip to South Africa has come to an end, he moves on to Tanzania now. What did you make of this weekend?
Well, I think before we get to the weekend specifically, I think it's also important to highlight the fact that President Obama started his visit to Africa in Senegal, which again, for very symbolic reasons, was very powerful. First, democracy in Senegal, and also the visit to Gorée Island, where he visited the door of no return, which also symbolized the lines or the ties that exist between South Africa and the United States in terms of slavery and so forth. So I think in terms of the South African leg of the relationship, it's important to link it to the first leg of his African tour. For South Africa, it was to a certain degree also clouded by the ill health of former President Nelson Mandela. So to a certain degree, I think it took away the shine out of what was supposed to be a very business-like type of visit.
So, do you think that took away? I mean, at the end of the day, I imagine what he had on his agenda of coming into South Africa, even though we've got Nelson Mandela that is not well at the moment. But I imagine everything he was mandated to do and wanted to do in South Africa, he did. So, am I right? Do you think this was stopped in any way?
No, definitely not. It's true. But the order of proceedings went ahead as initially planned. Both leaders had their bilateral talks, which focused on trade between South Africa and the United States. So I think it is true that there was a certain degree of normality. But I think the broader picture, the broader context in South Africa with regard to former President Nelson Mandela's ill health, to a certain degree, in my view, had an impact on what was supposed to be a much better visit to South Africa.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what was achieved during this visit. Obviously, we saw a lot of focus on the former President Nelson Mandela, and I mean, I think that it had to be that way. There was no other way that the trip could have gone ahead with a massive figure like Madiba in the position that he's in. But in terms of trade and economic relations between South Africa and the United States, what was accomplished? Were you happy with what was discussed, though?
Well, I think it's once again, it's important to perhaps allocate the visit within the broader U.S.-Africa relationship, which can be informed by the U.S.-Africa strategy, which was launched last year by President Obama. So I think to a certain degree, the United States has been trying to sort of re-engineer its relationship with Africa. And South Africa, being an entry point to a certain degree in Africa, is a very important partner. Trade between the two countries has been steadily increasing to reach around $22 billion US. And I think there's a lot of scope for the relationship to increase. I think it's also important to know that American companies are creating a lot of jobs in South Africa. You have 600 American companies which are present in South Africa, creating over 150,000 jobs. So it's a very important relationship, if I have to mention.
Yeah. I mean, will we see this increase? I mean, let's just take one deal, for instance. We talk about this sub-Saharan Africa, the electricity that he spoke about. I mean, $7 billion that's going to be put towards lighting up Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Would this see an influx now of more American companies coming in and perhaps creating jobs and helping this situation?
Yes, certainly. I think this was arguably the most important initiative announced by President Obama during the visit. But the unfortunate part of it is that it does not include South Africa. The Power Africa initiative looks at specific African countries, including Ethiopia, Tanzania, I think Kenya. So it excludes South Africa in that sense. But the important thrust of it is that it's packaged as looking at it's packaged as development to a certain degree cooperation, but I think it's more of an infrastructure program where the US are committed about $7 billion US, and the private sector is believed to have committed $9 billion US. So I think it's a very important initiative which looks at Africa's energy security needs in the future.
Yeah, let's talk about China, because President Obama almost brushed aside China and saying they weren't too concerned about Africa and China's relations, and that it didn't really threaten America's position too much. What do you think? I mean, do you really believe that's the case, that that the Americans are not too worried about China's influence in Africa?
No, I think the Americans are certainly worried about China's presence in Africa. It's important to know today that China is South Africa's largest trading partner. Yeah. So it should be of concern for a country like the United States, which is also a democracy like South Africa, and also two countries that share similar values. And broadly speaking, I think Chinese practices in Africa have been questioned, and also in some instances they've had corrosive effects on Africa's democratic structures and institutions. Yeah. So I think the U.S. as a key promoter of democracy and issues of human rights would be concerned. But I think the concern in recent years have been more at the economic level, because the United States has been losing out on Africa, treating Africa more as a security issue, focusing less on the trading aspects of the relation. And I think China has definitely changed the dynamic in that sense.
Most definitely. I'm hearing time's up, but there's just two issues I need to touch on, if we can do that very, very quickly. The war on terror, and of course the United States, also Barack Obama coming in and saying that he's not necessarily having a look at strengthening ties with Africa and military partnership with Africa, and particularly taking into consideration Al-Qaeda within Africa. And we heard one young lady specifically asking this question from Nigeria, talking about what's happening there with Boko Haram and all of these issues. Is this fair to say? Would it be the natural move for the US not to strengthen ties here in Africa in the fight against that?
I think the ties between the U.S. and Africa in the area of security are quite strong, in my view. As you may know, the U.S. has AFRICOM, which is basically based in Germany, which looks at the security issues on the continent. The U.S. has committed already $300 million annually to fight or to deal with security issues on the continent. 1,500 U.S. soldiers are based in Djibouti. So I think in terms of the security issues, the U.S. is quite present, and I think quite strongly so.
All right. Finally, Kenya. A lot of people wanting to know about his relationship with Kenya and why this trip didn't include Kenya. Do we always have to link President Barack Obama to Kenya?
Well, I think it's important. I think at the end of the day, that's what makes Obama a special case. He's the first black president of the United States, and his father is Kenyan. Yeah. So most definitely that link will come naturally. It's a pity that he did not visit Kenya during his visit.
Yeah, well, it's the ICC case and the process that I suppose is what is of interest to people.
Yeah, certainly. I think his explanation was that not necessarily that, it was more of the political transition that took place in Kenya recently, and that and he wanted to give the Kenyan leaders some time to settle in. But I think on the back of his mind, and also the U.S. policy makers, I think the indictment of Uhuru Kenyatta by the ICC certainly had a huge impact on whether he was to visit Kenya or not.
Absolutely. All right, thank you so much for talking to us here on Morning Live. Alfredo Hengari, Foreign Policy Head of the South African Institute of International Affairs. Let's take a break.